Great, and it's wonderful to be talking as members of a fellow civic society. I thought we'd just start with an insight into Salisbury. It's somewhere that I'm sure you're all very familiar with anyway, but I'm just going to put Salisbury into context. And we're just going to present the story in three parts: Salisbury and the Civic Society, civic pride, which is something that Joe Doak asked us to talk about, and which certainly set us a challenge. And Richard will be presenting the way forward for Salisbury. Okay. Salisbury, as you all well know, is a medieval cathedral city. We're situated in the southeast of Wiltshire, just below Salisbury Plain, with the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Stonehenge just 8 miles to the north. Unusually, we can identify the date of the start of the city as 1220, when the building of the cathedral began. Dwellings obviously grew up around the relocation and the building of the cathedral, and it was granted charter in 1227. So we've been a city from 1227, which is quite an achievement. Let's go forward. Our spectacular 13th century cathedral, which I'm sure you all know very well indeed. It boasts the tallest spire in the country, 123 metres. This is a fact now known worldwide, thanks to the infamous Russian terrorists during the Novichok incidents. So everybody knows the height of the spire, which is quite a way to achieve fame. It was a good bark that came out of Novichok. The cathedral houses a working 14th century clock and an original copy of the Magna Carta of 1215. There are some magnificent houses in Cathedral Close and some equally important architectural buildings within the city. Our wealth of heritage buildings and the beautiful streets all contribute to some quite substantial history. The Novichok incidents of 2018 knocked the stuffing out of the city. Few people knew what we were dealing with. The place was overrun with military and security personnel and health officials. People stayed away. Tourism and retail came to a standstill overnight. And the Christmas market was cancelled that year, which was a tragedy because they'd been building up a Christmas market progressively over the previous 5 years. Things gradually began to return to normal in 2019. This was a year which heralded an influx of specialists and consultants conducting numerous surveys and public consultations, which resulted in the Central Area Framework document and a rebranding of the city. I have to say, I never knew we were branded before this, but we are now branded, which of course is useful to know. With the arrival of the 2021 pandemic, we ground to a halt yet again. Shop closures hit the city centre with a vengeance. There were gaps everywhere, something I'm sure you experienced also here in Dorchester. Some have recovered, some we have lost forever, but on the positive side, it is gradually creating a different high street scenario. The tourists are back, and there is a real sense of activity and looking forward. Wiltshire Council described the Salisbury Area Central Framework as an overarching strategy to help shape the future of the city centre and to enable it to respond positively to recent challenges. The CAF makes a series of recommendations to guide future developments, initiatives and policies for the area, particularly the city centre, with the aim of bringing positive change to the city and making it an even more vibrant, attractive and sustainable place to work, live, work and visit. However, we still have major traffic problems, and the trial low traffic zone experiment in 2020 was abandoned within weeks of it being implemented. This, in spite of the CAF document highlighting that 84% of people consulted were in support of developing a street hierarchy to prioritise streets and spaces for pedestrians and cyclists over cars. So we're no further forward, really. The one exception is the River Park project. This is a joint initiative between Salisbury City and Wiltshire Council, the Environment Agency, and Swindon and Wiltshire Local Economic Partnership, And the initiative is currently actually in progress. They are digging up the River Avon. This is an ambitious scheme. These photographs just show a small example of the River Avon and what it's apparently going to look like. So we can only hope. The scheme is to create a green corridor along the banks of the River Avon, running through the centre of the city to create a people's park, wildlife corridor. The voles were captured and they're currently being rehoused in a Hampshire pond, and they're waiting to be released later in the year back into their new environment. We will have cycle routes and walkways, all contributing to vastly improved routes for visitors and the community to take us into the city centre. Equally important, and probably most important, the park will double as a necessary floodplain to combat one of the relentless effects of climate change, which is flooding. And Salisbury has come dangerously close to flooding, which of course is extremely dangerous considering our beautiful cathedral. If I just explain about our civic society. It was founded in 1960 with the aim of working to promote high standards of contemporary design in all aspects of the built environment within Salisbury and South Wiltshire, while safeguarding the historic buildings and landscape setting underpinning this area's special character. Our aims are to celebrate and commemorate the area's rich heritage and cultural life, to enhance and protect the built environment and landscape setting of the area, to encourage and promote high standards of design, management and maintenance, and to provide a stimulating programme of activities for our members. So we set ourselves quite a tall order, which I think we successfully fulfil. Our current membership stands at 448, so we're just south of 450. In that figure, we include 20 corporate members, a group I am personally keen to develop as I believe their contribution will be useful as influencers as we progress through the next few years. Although we have a very supportive membership, the Society is totally reliant upon a core team of 25 active volunteers. The executive is self-explanatory. We currently have 5 trustees, and operating alongside the executive are 2 committees, General Purposes and Development. Interestingly, after a period of finding it very challenging to lure members to join the core group, there's recently been an upturn in interest, which is really encouraging. So we're finding that people actually want to join us and be actively involved, which is something that for many years we found really difficult to recruit. So I'm not actually analysing why this has happened. I'm just enjoying the fact that it's happened and don't ask any questions, basically. The remit of the General Purposes team is to inform both members and guests of information about the place. We arrange visits to places of historic interest. We host talks on relevant subjects at least 2 or 3 times a year. We organise guided architectural and historical walks around the city and environs. Together with the 3 events arranged by the Development Committee, this means the Society provides an activity event or debate every month. We do take a break in December. Zoom, of course, is provided to be an incredibly useful facility, allowing events to continue through the worst of the winter months. Our celebration of Civic Days is intermittent. I don't know whether you celebrate Civic Days, but we try as much as we can, but we're reliant on whether people are available to actually put on a show for that. We contribute when we can to the National Heritage Open Days scheme in September. This again depends on whether we've got enough volunteers to undertake a project of this nature. As you can imagine, there's a wealth of material in Salisbury for Heritage Open Days. The Haunch of Venison is definitely being one of the most popular venues. This year, our theme is Rivers and Waterways of Salisbury, exploring the original drainage channels throughout the city. Museum talks, exhibiting the artefacts from those channels, walks along the 5 rivers that flow into the city, guided tours of the River Park project, and we're co-hosting with the Young Gallery, which is our communal gallery, an exhibition of contemporary art alongside their collection of river-themed paintings, an ambitious and exciting project. And I hope some of you will be able to join us because we've got some really interesting things going on. We have an exceptionally interesting programme of blue plaques to persons or locations who have either been influenced or have influenced Salisbury and South Wiltshire. The latest being to a man called Wolf Frank in Mere. Wolf Frank was the chief interpreter at the Nuremberg trials, and he was a pioneer in simultaneous interpretation, which was quite a significant thing. He ended up, he was a German Jew. He escaped from Germany during the war and came to live in England, so he was fluent in both German and English and had an extremely exciting and interesting life. In 2009, we published our book, Salisbury in Detail, celebrating some of the unique architectural details around the city. The foreword was written by Terry Pratchett, which was a coup, and content and photographs were contributed exclusively by society members. We publish a regular magazine, which we'll hand around just for you to have a look at. We usually do this 4 times a year, but this year we've actually just done it 3 times because we've also introduced a building awards booklet, which goes alongside our awards scheme, which is launched usually in January of this year, of each year, but this year was launched in April. The awards scheme is basically Richard's baby. It's a highly prestigious initiative and probably our key event, highly valued by award winners. I'm now going to move on to the sticky subject of civic pride. When Joe suggested it, I was a bit taken aback because I'd never really thought about civic pride. My immediate reaction is that it sounds an incredibly old-fashioned word, more applied to neatness of streets and flower beds, really. But actually giving it some thought, I realise it is quite an important consideration. Google says that it relates to how places promote and defend local identity and autonomy, and is often championed as a key value and aspiration of local government. I can't say that I've actually noticed that particularly, but we'll aspire to it. The population of Salisbury currently stands at 46,000. In 1801, it stood at 7,670, so it's been a slow burn. We don't have a lot of industry or business there in the city. Tourism is really our main business. Since the changes in 2009, the County of Wiltshire has become a unitary authority, with Wiltshire Council based at Trowbridge, leaving Salisbury with a city council only. The downside of the unitary authority is remoteness and what is often perceived as disinterest, as it tends to remove local identity and thereby local responsibility. The City Council is made up of 23 elected councillors, taking responsibility for allotments through to health centres, camping sites, community development, community orchards, memorial trees and benches, public toilets, sports pitches, and twinning and sister cities. It's not necessarily a list to light the imagination, but all important aspects of the city in their own right. We are lucky to have an extraordinarily beautiful city, some beautiful parks which are well cared for, and the twice-weekly charter market is a true asset. Civic space is of key importance, somewhere the community can gather, could also be seen to contribute to a sense of civic pride, and the new River Park will be a great addition to open community spaces. In Salisbury, we consider the role of the local civic society is to act as custodians of the built environment and landscape, and to inform the community about what is happening, often acting as a link between Wiltshire Council and the community. Over the years, there have been a considerable number of initiatives focusing on improving city for the good of its community. Extensive plans have been drawn up and heralded as the way forward. Sadly, these projects rarely get off the ground. They are too ambitious, unrealistic, or lack support. But I sense that the community is beginning to assert itself. There is a true sense of community spirit beginning to develop in Salisbury. I think as this develops, people are understanding that to voice opinions as realisations dawn that we are able to influence, particularly at a time when government places more emphasis upon community involvement. I hope that gives you an idea of our approach to civic pride and an idea of how we operate in Salisbury. I'm now going to hand you over to Richard.
Yes, this is really a quick skate through work, primarily work done by the Development Committee, which Stephanie has referred to, which I'm the secretary. So certainly touching on recovery issues, but also wider issues, resistance to large-scale house building. I think maybe some relevance. I'm not sure we can offer much in that field. Also our award scheme, which Stephanie mentioned, which Joe told me was something you had in the past and thinking about maybe reviving. Right, so the recovery question, we have had various meetings to do with recovery. This was in 2019, one of the meetings which Stephanie referred to the Development Committee organising. So this is basically what was happening at that time, post-Novichok, but pre-pandemic, in terms of attempts to get Salisbury going again. And the top left image is in fact of the Zizi's restaurant, which was one of the locales of the Skripal Novichok poisoning. And then later in the same year, we covered similar topics. And the two speakers for this first meeting in April were two people from Wiltshire Council, one of whom was the interim director for economic recovery. And that was a short-term post which has now ceased, but that was a particular effort by Wiltshire Council to try and focus on Salisbury in the wake of the Novichok events. And there had previously been a feeling in Salisbury that Wiltshire Council had rather tended to ignore Salisbury. I think they did quite a good job at this particular point. And then we had our second meeting in the same year. The first meeting, our planning forum, is mainly for our own members, but other people are also welcome. The open meeting is what it says. It is something which we try and get as many people, members and non-members to, without charging anyone, providing free drinks and nibbles. A good venue, the Salisbury Arts Centre. And we had two of the same speakers, and we also had somebody from the Environment Agency, and they were talking specifically about the River Park project, which, although it was not necessarily sparked by Novichok, it had something been in the offing for a while, and it was essentially brought about because changed flood mapping showed greater flood risk in Salisbury, and that's what brought in the significant Environment Agency funding. And the whole project will cost something like £23 million. So that's quite a decent investment in Salisbury. This is going on to a series of slides from the April presentation. And this was some preliminary views of what Salisbury might hope to achieve from a bid to the government's Future High Streets Fund. I don't know whether Dorchester got involved in that, but essentially this was a pot of money that cities were invited to bid for works that would actually encourage retail, recovery of retail, which is under threat anyway. Didn't help Salisbury because of Novichok, but a countrywide thing. So we had a presentation in April which showed particularly an initiative to improve Fisherden Street. Fisherden Street is a street which connects Salisbury railway station to the city centre, so it's quite an important route. It's also a marginal shopping street, of which cities tend to have a few. North Street in Leeds, I remember when I lived there, was a similar sort of case. Marginal, not full of multiple chains, but having some very interesting shops, in many cases independent shops, and certainly worth promoting from that point of view. So this is a street scene in Salisbury currently, and what the Wiltshire Council proposals were apparently going to promote was a much jazzed up version of the street. It's also, according to this image, a street with no vehicular traffic in it, and it's being used for street markets and plenty of people around. So that was an image that was shown in April 2019. There's another one. This is City Hall, which is an entertainment venue owned by Wiltshire Council in Salisbury. Slightly sadly treated originally Art Deco building in Fisherton Street. And this is what the presentation showed it. So there's not actually, I mean, there is something that's going on the left-hand side, because what is currently a blank wall on the left-hand side has been shown as redesigned with some nice glazed effort. But quite a lot of the effect is just by putting a lot of fancy lights and so forth in. So it shows a level of ambition. We didn't take these as indicating necessarily concrete proposals. They showed the sort of thing that Wiltshire Council was hoping to achieve for Fisherton Street. Here, again in Fisherton Street, this is where one of the branches of the Avon, there are 3 branches, well, one's a mill stream, 2 branches of the Avon flow through central Salisbury. And this is where one of the branches cuts across Fisherton Street with a fairly mundane bridge. And the particular proposal outlined at that point was to actually deck over the river at that point and provide a nice sitting out area, which we thought was an excellent idea. So what happened next? Essentially what happened was that Salisbury's bid for future High Street funding was successful. And without an awful lot of public consultation on the specific way in which the money allotted, which was £9.3 million, how it was going to be spent. That had been pretty much established by Wiltshire Council beforehand and formed the basis of their bid to the government. And having had the bid accepted, there wasn't an awful lot of leeway in how Wiltshire Council spent the money. So there was a particular focus on Fisherton Street, picking up on the suggestions in April 2019, and £3.2 million goes to Fisherton Street, the Fisherton Gateway, the gateway into the city. And so this is the time when you might hope that some of the things we've seen in the last few slides would actually come to fruition. And what we actually have in Fisherton Street, don't worry too much about the detail of this, which you may or may not be able to read, but essentially we have a highway engineering scheme. We have slightly widened pavements. We have some crossover points where the carriageway is built up to facilitate pedestrian crossing of the street. And we have some changes to bus stops and so forth. And the Civic Society felt that this was pretty disappointing for the spending of over £3 million, given that the level of ambition previously seen was something completely different. It was actually a much more vitalised street. Now, these works would improve the street. They would improve the link between the station, which was the other facet of the scheme, which I haven't got much time to deal with. Basically, they would have improvements. Would they improve £3 million to the tune of £3 million? And we found this quite disappointing. Nothing at all about the street market scene. The decking over the river was acknowledged, but all we were told was that had been vetoed by Natural England. The Environment Agency, also involved in no problem with it. Natural England said it reduced light levels in the river and damaged wildlife. To which our response was, well, it doesn't have to be wooden decking, it can be perforated metal, it could be glass decking, which actually would be quite nice visually, and would presumably have very little impact on the wildlife. But apparently Natural England had a veto on this, so there's no form of decking out at that particular central point in the street. There's a very enticing blank wall next to that proposed decking, which would be a wonderful locale for a nice bit of trompe-l'oeil decoration. All the Wiltshire Council scheme referred to was some opportunities of art on street cabinets, which is not quite the same thing, really. There is a separate independent initiative which Stephanie is involved with to try and get some community art. But in terms of Wiltshire Council's commitment, Wiltshire Council has a core strategy which is meant to encourage public art. In the case of this proposed expenditure, they actually did nothing at all, basically. So we've written in, the consultation period ended a month or so ago. We put our comments in saying that we had a debate at committee as to whether we were disappointed by the ambition shown or very disappointed. And by a strong majority, we were very disappointed by what we saw. And we put our comments in as constructive as we can and ask the Wiltshire Council will come and discuss them with us, we hope. Our proposal for the street layout, rather than a few widened pavements and crossover points, was actually a shared space approach, whereby you have one level surface across, and this has been proven successful in many places, that actually it's down to drivers to take a bit more care, to acknowledge that pedestrians have priority, and to drive at the appropriate speed. There's meant to be a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit in Fisherton Street. It's not often observed. The shared space would enable that, but shared spaces, I think, become slightly less popular recently. We made the suggestion. We're not particularly expecting Wiltshire Council to take it up. This is going over the railway station, which was the other. In fact, there's £5 million being spent on the station forecourt. We put in a proposal for an improvement to the access from the station to the Fisherton Street, designed by one of our committee architect members, James Selman, with rather than people entering the railway station via a mini roundabout, they can actually use a separate route which comes in via a specially created parklet. It's a nice idea. We've put it in, we've put this illustration in. I suspect that, as is often the case with consultations, minds are made up, they acknowledge what people are saying, but are they going to have to go back and have a fundamental rethink? I fear probably not. And the other remaining part of the £9.3 million is doing up a listed property in the marketplace, which may or may not be targeted as a test case to try and encourage the use of the vacant upper floors above shops, or as living over the shop, which is not a new idea. And this particular address in Salisbury, 47 Bluebell Row, is a good example of a shop with unused space above, which could be utilised. But the building actually is far more than that. It is an extremely interesting historic building with, for instance, the remains of an early 18th century coffee house in a disused part of the back. There was dismantled panelling, which could be reassembled. It would be expensive, as would doing up the whole building. The project's been costed by a very respected local architect, Gerald Steers, probably needing something like £2 million to actually rescue the whole building. And Wiltshire Council has allocated £800,000, which will do some good, but it won't rectify the whole of this particular property. To what extent it'll encourage the revival of the retail trade, I don't know. To me, the whole thing about £9.3 million designed to revitalise the high street is to what extent that's actually going to achieve that kind of level of success from this particular expenditure. So the Civic Society has been taking an interest in this for a long time, at meetings which have covered it, and has expressed its disappointment to the actual outcome. We shall see what happens. This is going on to the field of housing development. This is a particular case, special to Salisbury. So although it's a river valley development, it can't be said to be directly comparable to the controversial development north of Dorchester. I should say, by the way, that I did live in Dorchester for 3 years in the 1970s. I lived in Damers Road. I lived before that for a while in Piddle-Trentide. And it's very nice to be back in this area, which I have a certain amount of familiarity with. But back to this particular shop, what this shows is the way the River Avon Valley, as a green space, actually finds its way into the heart of the city. So the cathedral is visible top left in this slide. It's only a few hundred yards from this unspoiled green space. There's some gardens, Churchill Gardens, but the road that runs, the yellowy brown coloured road at the top of the housing development, in the middle of the slide, that is the limit of development. There are two fields. There are the two fields underneath the annotation Harnham Bridge, and the owners, a local estate and a local almshouse owner, would like to develop in it for housing. And what we have at the moment, that's the view across the fields, the Britford Lane fields. Classic view of the cathedral in the background. They want to fill that up with houses. And that is something which has been going on for several years, which the Civic Society has attempted to contend with. It's linked up with a local Britford Lane Action Group, who were invited to have a stand at our Civic Day event in 2017 when we took on Salisbury Guildhall for Civic Day activities. We put our views to Wiltshire Council about the inappropriateness of this development. And we've tried, with what means we have, to resist the incorporation of this site in any local plan, which is key. And there has not so far been any planning application, which I'm slightly surprised at, because Wiltshire Council cannot demonstrate a 5-year housing supply, which theoretically might leave sites like this vulnerable. And we know that architects have been brought in and designed a housing scheme for here. No application has ever come in. One of the things we did to try and help resist this was to engage one of our members, who is a planning inspector, now retired, actually lives in Devon. He came up to talk to the Britford Lane group about the ways in which this proposal might be resisted if it ever came to a public inquiry, which so far, luckily, it never has done. And it's all gone quiet recently, but I don't think that means that this particular view of the cathedral is necessarily safe forever. And that's inevitably something that the Civic Society tends to get involved with. The major urban expansion to Salisbury tends to be on the periphery. It's the eastern side of the city. It's up at Old Sarum, slightly isolated from the city. A lot of housing goes up there. And we know full well that the only chance of resisting it is at the local plan stage. If something is accepted in the plan, it's pretty much inevitable. All you can talk about then are the details of development. Given that you're talking about volume house builders, you know they're going to come in with pretty low ambitions, and it's actually very difficult to change anything. We had a presentation in our committee a few years ago by some architects who are working for Barratt Homes, a particular scheme, and they showed us this bog standard sort of suburban layout, neo-vernacular, lowest common denominator houses, which we found fairly depressing. And we said to them, how about actually getting some contemporary architecture to clothe this scheme? And they said, yeah, we'd love that, but our clients aren't interested. They know they can sell the kind of houses we're designing here. So there are two sites I'm showing briefly. One of them is on the west of Salisbury. You're coming into Salisbury from the west, you get this splendid view of the cathedral. This is a site which, there's a large site to the right-hand side of the road, which we thought was acceptable. This was a late addition to one of the many phases of the local plan, the housing site allocations, DPD. And we resisted the incorporation of this site because of its impact on views of the cathedral. Historic England also objected. Wiltshire Council's conservation officers also objected. The council proceeded to put the scheme in, went to public inquiry, and the inspector said, oh, it's not ideal, but I think this is probably okay. So you end up with a scheme, which is now a planning application, which has a view corridor, so that from certain places coming into town, you can still see the cathedral spire through a gap in the houses, many positioned before or after that. You've got the houses blocking the view again. But that is pretty well inevitable now because it's been accepted as part of the local plan. This is a later review, that was about 2018. This is a review last year of the local plan, and inevitably you've allocated X amount of land here and Y amount there. You've got more land at Old Sarum. You come back next time and we need to find even more houses. The actual total specified for Salisbury in this iteration of the local plan was 930 houses, which is not great, but Chippenham, which is one of the other substantial towns in Wiltshire, were asked to find room for over 3,000. So from that point of view, Salisbury probably got off fairly lightly. This is site 6. This is over on the east side of the cathedral, coming up, or southeast side, coming up from the Ringwood direction. Another field posited for housing, with a splendid view of the cathedral in front of it. And we objected to this site, but there were other sites which hadn't quite made the cut. There was one site which we thought would probably be better, less impact on views of the cathedral, some archaeological issues, but not insurmountable. But in the end, we said, no, we're resisting this site. We're not going to suggest any other site to actually replace it. What you need to do is to find ways of finding more housing within Salisbury. You need to have, in some cases where it's appropriate, high density housing, and you need to use brownfield sites. And that was a pre-planned consultation. We may find out later this year whether this particular site has been incorporated or not. This is just touching on a specific aspect of dealing with planning applications. This is the whole story behind this is far too complicated to go into. But this is a building which was originally proposed for a relocated Salisbury Library, again in Fisherton Street. Somewhat curious design, which is probably trying too hard. And the bit in the foreground with the twin gable roofs is like a sort of traditional Salisbury timber frame building that's been propped up on stilts, which is slightly odd concept. But what the architects for this proposal tried quite hard to do is to actually incorporate some interesting materials and some good quality detailing. And at that time, that was a proposal for the library. For various reasons, that didn't happen. It's now come back in again as a planning application, not this time for a library, but for a Travelodge hotel. It was previously going to house a Travelodge hotel. Now it houses a slightly larger one, and there's some vacant space, unspecified use downstairs. And what you realise when you look at the new application is that they have used the identical visualisation for a slightly different, but not radically different scheme. You can still see the books behind the shop windows. They haven't bothered to change that, even though it's no longer proposed for a library, which is okay. And the council's urban design advisor said, well, this seems very similar to the scheme that's already been approved. We haven't got much to say about it. Actually, if you zoom in on the CGI, which I've done using very low technology, so this is pretty low resolution stuff, you can just about see here, this is an area which is sort of towards the right of it's the right-hand view onto Fisherton Street in front of the Northern Reformist Church. There is a brick wall between two elements of the development. And if you look at it, it's not just ordinary brickwork. It is what they term expressed headers. So basically, every header is projecting, and it almost looks a bit like it's header bond rather than Flemish bond or English bond. So you've got this attempt to create interesting brickwork and also very expensive brickwork. This is not bog standard developer stuff. Similarly, in another part of the scheme, you've got some green dividing points between shop windows. But actually, if you look towards the upper half, say they take the pillar on the left, the upper half is conventional horizontally laid brickwork. The bottom half is actually vertically laid basket weave brickwork using a particular brick Ibstock Umbra sawtooth. And this is the result of a lot of work done by the previous developers using London architects to actually make an interesting scheme. Their architect came and talked to the Civic Society on several occasions. We talked specifically about the basket weave brickwork. Seemed a good idea. Was it sufficiently tied into the scheme? Yes, he was sure, the architect was sure it would be conditioned. And this development has now been taken up by a completely different client. The architects have disappeared. It's for a different purpose. And all you've got to actually indicate this level of detail are these CGI visualizations. You can't read these kind of details into the application drawings. And CGI visualizations are not going to be what the planning authority gives permission for. They give permission for the drawings. The CGI is just an illustration of it. And it's only in the CGIs you see this level of detail. So that's a particular case where it's worth the Civic Society getting involved, because even the council's own urban design advisors hadn't picked up this particular point. And if people like us don't actually spend a bit of time looking into these things and making relevant points to the authorities, nobody else is going to. A couple of things just in passing, just to illustrate the range of what we do, all intended to create a better city, and starting way back before Novichok. This was actually a 2010 initiative to create a traffic scheme in the city centre to basically keep a better control over motorised vehicles and improve things for push bikes, pedestrians and so forth. There have been many pedestrianisation schemes in Salisbury for the central area. This was a particularly good one, which we put forward. It's just one of the things we do. We didn't achieve much with this one, but we won't stop trying. This is a slightly different case. This is a statue called The Man with Arms Open, by a sculptor called Giles Penny, bronze casting. This photo was taken in 1999 when there was an exhibition in Salisbury called Shape of the Century. And this particular sculpture was voted the people's favourite of all the sculptures in the city. And the Civic Society has been trying for some time, or hoping for some time, to bring it back, or to bring a new casting back. There's another casting, this is in Canary Wharf. And I would love to see this statue. We identified a space for it, which Wiltshire Council, the owners, seem reasonably happy with, but it's all fallen foul of incredibly complicated procedures about redeveloping parts of the city centre, which I wouldn't dream of trying to bore you with. Just to say that the Man with Arms Open is still something we would hope to see brought back to Salisbury. Quite how we achieve it, I'm not sure. And Stephanie has already produced this booklet, so I'm just talking very briefly about the award scheme. We've got 2 or 3 spare copies of our booklet, and who wants to take one away with them. So for the first time, last year's award scheme winners were recorded in a special standalone publication rather than just forming part of one of our, generally speaking, quarterly magazines, which is an innovation which seems to have gone down well and will probably be, almost certainly be repeated. And I'm just following this up with a very quick skate through. I'm running out of time, so this is not an attempt to deal in any detail with some of our award winners. It's just to indicate the sort of range of things that that we found to give awards to. It's the Apple House in a village outside Salisbury, partly a conversion of an old fruit storage shed with contemporary element worked in as well. And the super client is a brilliant interior designer and a very imaginative local architect who's won several awards from us. That is actually a bridge for the aforementioned Terry Pratchett. I'm a stonemason by trade. I didn't actually construct this bridge, but I found Terry the right person to design and build it, a very talented stonemason called Sarah Pennell. And I got planning permission for him, and with much more difficulty, permission from the Environment Agency. They're a curious crowd to deal with. One of the things I had to do was to carry out a water bowl survey. Now, luckily, I knew somebody who was qualified to do that and also was happy to do the work in return for one of Terry's autographs for her son. So it's quite an easy arrangement. It wasn't a very difficult job. This was in the summer, so she sat around in his garden in the summer, and the stream that flows under this bridge is actually a winter bourne. It only flows in the winter. It does not flow in the summer. So the chances of seeing any water bowls on site were absolutely zero. Nevertheless, you carry out a survey, keeps the Environment Agency happy, and life continues. And it was, I knew Terry slightly. It was an absolute tragedy when he passed on a few years ago. He chaired, in fact, he chaired one of the judging panels for our award scheme in 2006. Probably the cleverest person I have ever met in my life, I would say. This is a bus shelter, Millennium Bus Shelter, north of Salisbury, simple timber frame building. This is sort of thing which inevitably comes up in Salisbury, 15th century timber frame building. This was actually clad in tiles previously, and nobody realised what lay behind it. And it has some surviving medieval timber windows, and has had new, not particularly ornate, just simple new timber windows added as part of this conservation repair project right in the corner of Salisbury Marketplace. This is a bit of a fake, but it's a very endearing kind of fake. This is a building called Cowpens, which is on the Fonthill Estate west of Salisbury. The Fonthill Estate is a quite extraordinary area of land containing the most remarkable history of houses which came and went, including William Beckford's Fonthill Abbey, the most famous, but by no means the only one. This was an isolated development taking advantage of some cow pens, which would not normally get consent, but Wiltshire Council acknowledged that the locale, Fonthill Estate, justified this kind of Fonthill, this kind of a folly type structure. And we thought, yeah, why not? Let's give it an award. This is a contemporary house. This is Mere in the western part of our area, where the plaque to Wolf Frank has gone up, Stephanie mentioned. A nice contemporary scheme by some architects from over Shepton Mallet Way. We're not just limited to buildings, we're dealing with the built environment. This is a creation of an artificial riverbank in the middle of Salisbury. So we gave that an award quite a few years ago. This is a new statue on the west front of Salisbury Cathedral by an incredibly talented sculptor called Jason Battle. There's 5 new sculptures on the west front, and you don't get permission to put sculptures on the west front of Salisbury Cathedral without being very talented and going through an enormous palaver to get to that process. So this is a particularly nice example, pair of angel statues we gave an award to. That was actually Terry's year sharing a judging panel, I think. Contemporary edition, this is a listed building called Roche Court. It's now the New Art Centre, east of Salisbury, well worth a visit. So this is connecting early 19th century house with an orangery of similar period, and not in any way trying to ape the style of the original buildings. This is a contemporary design, and we thought it worked splendidly well. So that was one of our award winners. Stonehenge Visitor Centre, not applauded by everyone, but I think it's a pretty successful building. This is a Millennium project, not a Millennium project. This is the Salisbury U3A's Millennium Sundial in the middle of Salisbury. And finally, I would say not just one of the best modern buildings in Salisbury, one of the best buildings in Salisbury, full stop, is a building of around 2006 designed by Stanton Williams, architects of Salisbury, as an extension to an early 18th century house, which at that time was housing the offices of Salisbury District Council, now houses the offices of Wiltshire Council and the police station thrown in for good measure. And this extension is a superb addition to the site. There's a medieval church, which is now Salisbury Arts Centre, immediately to the right. Might not work in every context, might be a bit too challenging in Salisbury Marketplace. In this particular context, where unfortunately it's not seen that well by people, this is an absolutely wonderful modern building, one of my favourite Salisbury buildings of any period. So that's a quick trawl through. I think the next slide is something else. Yep, that's a quick trawl through our award scheme, because Joe said it was worth covering because you had one. You didn't currently have one, but you might go back to the idea. Salisbury is different in one particular way, that it not only covers Salisbury with its 46,000 population, it also covers a large area of South Wiltshire, so it has a much bigger catchment area. And we organise our award scheme on an alternating basis. We look at new buildings one year, and we look at work to existing buildings in the following year, which works very well. So for each category, we've got 2 years catchment period. For a place like Dorchester, I suspect that if you want an award scheme, which I think are wonderful things to have, thoroughly encourage you to, I would say that you might need to be looking at a slightly lesser category of award. You might be looking at, say, people who responsibly repair timber windows in a non-listed building, rather than putting plastic ones in, which is the sort of thing we thoroughly applaud, but we probably actually wouldn't give it an award to. It would be too small a scale. So you could probably look at slightly smaller projects, or you could run an award scheme every 2 or 3 years rather than trying to make an annual thing of it. But I think I would thoroughly encourage it if you are seriously thinking about returning to it. I think they're extremely useful things. They're ways of encouraging civic pride, apart from anything else, that you're actually recognising achievements in the city which improve the city. You're bringing them to people's attention and trying to make the most of them. And our booklet, which Stephanie will be pounding the streets, delivering 100 copies to anyone who might be interested. Well, it won't just be Stephanie, but it's gone to our members, it's gone to anyone who picked up awards at our awards event a couple of months ago, and we will be attempting to circulate it around local estate agents and solicitors and so forth. Anyone who might be interested might give it a bit of space. And finally, this is a specific project which actually isn't a project as such, but it's an aspiration. This again is in Fisherton Street. But Fisherton Street is an interesting street. This happens to be number 47, as with 47 Blue Ball Row. There are at least 2 other buildings with a number 47 of particular interest, which I'm sure is no more than a coincidence. 47 Fisherton Street is an Art Nouveau shop front, probably about 1906. The green glazed terracotta, the faience, was made by Carters of Poole, who eventually became Poole Pottery. And why does it look so forlorn? It looks so forlorn because in 1964, the then owner got somebody in, hooligans basically, to smash off all the projecting bits of terracotta. Anything that stuck out a bit was just hacked off or knocked off with a hammer. Why did he do this? Don't really understand it, but what he achieved afterwards was that is the same shop front. You can't even see the curved window. He's just had it rendered over to create this most banal, ugly thing. We'd love to know who he was, why he did it, and we may possibly find out. And the final shot is not a photograph. There are old photographs, but this drawing is probably the most expressive way of seeing what this looked like in its prime. So you've got these splendid projecting brackets, which were just hacked off in 1964. You've got a wonderful looking door, which from photographs, I'm not quite sure that's necessarily accurate depiction, but it'd be nice to put something like that door back. What you probably wouldn't necessarily want to put back is all the hanging dead animals, even though the hooks are still in place on the shop front to hang them from. That's probably a step too far. You'd need to incorporate a plinth across the open shop front to make it viable for modern shop use. It's a wonderful concept, which we first looked at in 2011, got a price from a specialist, couldn't at that time raise the money from initially, one concept I had was people who had received awards from us who were known to be wealthy. Quite easy to identify some of them. So I went round and asked some of them. A couple said, yeah, I'll give you a bit, including the treasurer of the Conservative Party, as one would hope. But one of the big hopes was Terry Pratchett, who could have financed this out of the loose change down the back of his sofa. So I went to see him and his wife Lynn and said, actually, I don't like Art Nouveau. And that, I'm afraid, was the end of any hopes of getting any finance from Terry Pratchett. And in the end, we gave up. We've revived the idea again recently because, partly because of the emphasis on Fisherton Street, which this would be a sort of a flagship project to improve the street. And we need to basically get an update on the price. We need to reconcile some discrepancies in the original schedule of work. We need to get a comparative price. We need to look at funding. The Heritage Lottery Fund is an option, but they would not fund the building. They would only fund a community project embracing the building, encompassing all sorts of minority groups, and they would fund up to £100,000 for a privately owned property. I'm guessing that the original price will have more or less doubled, probably for various reasons. And it could be a couple of £100,000. So we're way off the stage, even making a decision whether to actually go into a fundraising mode. But it's something we'd love to do. It would be nice if at some point that terribly distressed shop front could get back to something more like that. But, fingers crossed. If we turn up on your streets with our begging bowls, you'll know that we've at least reached the stage of trying to seek the money. So that was my final shot. I should emphasise this is an aspiration. It's not a project. We hope it will become a project. There's a lot of talking to be done before actually reach that stage. But fingers crossed we can do something for this sadly distressed shopfront. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very varied and interesting talk. Would you be prepared to answer some questions, if there are questions? Can we start with the audience here? Has anybody got a question they'd like to put? Yes. I'll repeat your question to make it. The question is, on sharing streets, did you manage to get any meetings with highway engineers to discuss the question, the principles and how it would work? Or was it just a sort of a lack of dialogue, dialogue in the depth? Do you want to?
Richard, I think you're
right. So we need to answer from here. Because,
yeah.
I would hope that the average highways engineer should not be completely ignorant as to what shared space is. It's not a new idea. It's had some very successful exhibitions in expositions in Exhibition Road in Kensington, for instance. At Chorley in Lancashire, incredibly successful. There was a wonderful person called Ben Hamilton Bailey, who was a great exponent of shared space, who sadly died a few years ago. He had a wonderful way of presenting the advantages of it. And there is in fact a Department of Transport, a government publication which actually explains what shared space is. It's not a particularly novel idea. Did we manage to discuss this with highway engineers? The Fisherton Street proposal is project managed by a highway engineer. I think that all we've done basically is react to their proposal when we saw it. Could we have raised the question earlier? Possibly, but we have now offered or suggested that a discussion between them and ourselves would be useful. Silence has resulted from that in the last 6 weeks. I think, to be honest, it is such a radical idea for a conservative bunch of people to turn the whole of Fisherton Street into a shared space exercise. We made the comment, which we firmly believe in, the chances of it being taken up are probably not all that great, I'm afraid.
Can I perhaps transform it into a question? Delight was expressed in what you showed us by way of modern building or contemporary building. Was this difficult to bring about, good design of this nature? Do they tend to favour sort of pastiche buildings rather than innovative designs?
I think there is an illusion in Salisbury that the planners will resist anything modern and ask for pastiche. I think in practice, plenty of the planners would actually love to see some interesting buildings. They just don't get proposed. It is down to the client. And that particular splendid modern building, the extension to the Bourne Hill Council offices, was a result of a particular chain of events where the client was Salisbury District Council, which was about to go out of business. And they had a healthy pot of money. Things got very complicated. The then administration actually lost power against the national trend because of an action group designed to resist the building, harping on something called the Secret Garden, which was next to it, which was basically just a stick to beat Salisbury District Council with. And the upshot of it all was that the building, when finally built, was only 2/3 of its originally designed size and cost a lot more than the original proposal would have. So it was a complicated one-off process, chain of events, state of affairs. I'm not sure that Bourne Hill, that particular wonderful modern building, has ever been picked up by anyone else. The Civic Society will always try and encourage it. We've been involved in the Salisbury Neighbourhood Plan, which had a design chapter, and one of the things that we're hoping that will say is basically do look to good contemporary design, and what the award scheme looks for is exactly that. I can show other examples which are contemporary buildings. I could also show a few neo-Georgian buildings. We won't give an award to a neo-Georgian building unless it's exceptionally well done. And just to sort of finish off with a comment, I don't want to get too controversial, but my comment on Dorchester would basically relate to Panbury. I've been watching Panbury, I haven't been there for a year or two, I've watched it as it's grown. It's a very interesting experiment, and it's a great deal better than the average housing estate on the edge of Salisbury. But could you not take the same gains, the same responsible approach to traffic movement, the needs of pedestrians and so forth, and actually put some modern contemporary architecture around it rather than harping back a couple of 100 years?
Can I just add, I also think it's the role of a civic society to promote new buildings and to look around and try and actually celebrate them. Also, one of the aspects that we're going to develop over the next few years is encouraging modern architects to come and talk to us. And instead of always harking back to the past, we're going to look very much to the future of buildings. And I think that's part of the role of the Civic Society, to move things forward.
Very interesting. Perhaps we can do something as well. Further question. The questioner has just spent a fortnight in Holland, where he visited The Hague, Delft and Leiden, and he remarked that there was very, very low traffic, basically because no through traffic was allowed beyond 10:30 in the morning. Would a scheme of this sort be possible in Salisbury?
Shall I start this and you finish? I think our low traffic zone scheme was very poorly implemented, both on timing and actually sort of background information. It was dumped upon us in a way, and people panicked. It was also at a time of the lockdowns, and so the shopkeepers, retailers and high street panicked as well, because they said that there was going to be no business at all, even though in fact it was COVID and the lockdowns that created the lack of business. There were signs put up all over the streets redirecting traffic. It was seen to be a very temporary solution. And if only we'd gone about it in a slower and a more measured way, we'd actually considered it more, and it hadn't been such a surprise or such a shock to people. People who lived within the city panicked as well. And I think we needed to do it more slowly. I think your idea of actually doing visits to cities that have successfully reduced the amount of traffic in their centres is an exceptionally good idea. Maybe we'll start organising tours to Leiden and to The Hague. Would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I think just possibly to reflect back on something that happened 20 years ago when a major part of Salisbury High Street was pedestrianised. There was an interim experimental period. I remember a public meeting, which was an outcry. One of the business owners was saying, if this pedestrianisation doesn't cease immediately, I'm going to go out of business. You asked her 2 or 3 years later, so we're going to do away with the pedestrianisation, she'd have been appalled because it was manifestly successful. It was a great benefit to businesses in the street. There was just this inbuilt conservative attitude, and it's a problem. It's a question of how to get around that. And Salisbury is probably no more conservative than the average place of its sort, but it's certainly pretty conservative. So to actually demonstrate, and possibly you need to organise trips to other places where it has been done successfully to actually show, no, it's not such a novel, appalling idea. It's actually something that makes sense and will work for you. But it's always a struggle achieving that, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes?
Yeah.
So the question briefly is Dorchester at the moment, Dorchester Town Council is preparing a master plan, but it's a sort of bumpy and bitty process without any real theme or inspiration. The query is, has anything been done better in Salisbury? You did mention that there was a neighbourhood plan, which we don't actually have.
Yes, neighbourhood plans are slightly different, but I think to be encouraged, Salisbury was actually quite late in coming to it. Yes, there is a Maltings master plan, which evolved 2 or 3 years ago, which we commented on at various stages. I'm afraid it's a bit of a mystery to me personally, the actual efficacy of a master plan. They're nice ideas, but they carry with them no actual promise of actually achieving anything much. It's a bit like Salisbury's Central Area Framework, which is a sort of master plan for the whole city and duplicates to some extent. So the Maltings master plan has a major element, the River Park project, which Stephanie mentioned, £23 million of expenditure. But it wasn't responsible for it. It just took on board something that was going to happen anyway because the funding had been found. So the master plan sets out various ways in which the Maltings, which is an interesting site, which has loads of potential for improvement, how it could be developed. What it doesn't carry with it is any promise of how anything is actually done. So it tells the developer, if you wish to develop this site, we would expect to see X and Y. Originally, the Maltings was probably going to be a shopping centre. That's obviously much less popular now. And there's certainly scope for some reasonably high density housing there. But until somebody actually comes in, a developer comes in and says, right, I'm going to do something, at that point, there is a master plan in place, which the council will refer to and say, well, these are the constraints on you. But the master plan per se does not actually get anything much going. And I think that that's one of the problems with them, probably.
What was your process within the Civic Society for coming up with that vision for that area?
I'm not sure we came up with a vision for that area particularly. We responded. I mean, it's too complicated to go into, but there were various proposals for redeveloping the Maltings, which we had meetings about, and they actually included that rather funny building I showed with all the detail. If you zoom into it, that is on the periphery of the Malting site, and that was actually would have been part of the original redevelopment, which included, for instance, a new cinema in Salisbury and all sorts of things which have now fallen by the wayside. I think our process was probably reactive rather than proactive. I don't think we've ever sat down and said, this is what we think should happen with the Maltings. When people come up with ideas, then there's something to go on, and you can actually respond and say, well, this could work. This isn't going to work. In practice, all the commercial developers that came in on that site, first of all, they kept changing their identity. They've changed their names overnight, which I didn't quite understand. But they've all sort of faded away again, basically. So it's an unsatisfactory process. Even if we had ideas, we haven't got the means of implementing them. So I think reaction rather than proaction is probably how it's mostly going to be.
Can I just add to that?
Of course.
We did use the opportunity of an open meeting that we have as an annual event, and we invited everybody involved, the local MP, the developers, anybody else who was involved in that particular scheme. And that was the first time we actually got over 100 people at a meeting. So again, it was the Civic Society actually providing a forum for discussion, even though we didn't influence anything or we perhaps weren't necessarily involved in it. We did start to transmit and actually inform people about what was happening and what the potentials were. And we made the community aware. And I think, again, that was another successful impact of a Civic Society initiative.
We have a question from the online audience. Can I ask Alistair to unmute?
Thank you.
And ask your question.
Absolutely. I was wondering if from Salisbury Civic Society's experience, is there anything that either the Civic Society or the relevant local authority could do to improve the relationship between the two organisations? It's apparent to me from what you've been saying, particularly over the street, where you were shown the most enticing pictures, and then at the end of the day, you get a bit of highway work, a real disappointment. there's a gap which clearly the Civic Society could help to fill. What could local authorities do, or civic societies, to improve the relationship between the two, since they share so much in common in terms of, you know, the future of our towns?
We've been trying ever since we existed to improve relations with the local authority. And I'm not necessarily holding the local authority to blame. It is a very difficult process. And occasionally you find enlightened councillors you might be able to talk with. There are enlightened planning officers. We have constant dialogue with the two local conservation officers. We're all singing from the same hymn sheet, but that is not quite the same thing as having influence at a higher level of policy making. It's something we've attempted to do. I wasn't around in 1960, but the society reformulated in 1985. Ever since then, we've been talking about this sort of thing. We fail, I'm afraid. Is there anything we could be doing more positively, Stephanie?
I think building partnerships with the people who you want to who create the dialogue with is incredibly important, but it's a time-consuming effort. And people involved with local councils, of course, have no time. I think that's a real problem. And it's finding the opportunity to develop a forum where you can actually discuss. I mean, I think Wiltshire Council, to a degree, are quite good. They do give the Civic Society an opportunity to view plans before they are put to general consultation.
Not often.
Sometimes, working on the positive, we do have a view to it, but it has taken a lot of battering at the door to be able to achieve that. But I think it is about building partnerships, and that takes a huge amount of time. I am looking at it at the positive side because I think it's terribly important to look at the positive side. There seems to be a lot of negativity about dealings with local councils, and one can appreciate that they are under a huge amount of pressure. And of course, they're limited on funding. That's the other initiative. That's the other problem.
Can I just return very briefly to the question of the dumbing down of the Fisherton Street proposals to a highway engineering work? I need to be fair to Wiltshire Council. Their reason for giving up much of their aspirations is that the amount they'd asked for under the Future High Streets Fund was nothing like what they actually got. In fact, they got 69.5% of what they bid for, which appears to have been a standard figure, as far as I can understand. They didn't get everything they wanted, and this was explained by them as being the reason for the failure to do anything more than change street services. I think it's not an adequate excuse, but it's certainly some justification. There is some reason why that particular street was dumbed down in the sense of what Wiltshire Council was hoping to achieve for it.
Thank you. Are there any other questions online?
I suppose I might ask one. I know Steph at the very beginning mentioned about the increase in membership and interest in the Civic Society in Salisbury, and she said she wasn't going to explore why. But I just wonder whether she might suggest some reasoning for that increase in interest.
A big increase is perhaps a bit of an exaggeration, but I think one of the things that we've noticed is that people are prepared to actually take on active roles within the society, and this is something that we've really found very difficult over the past few years. We keep on appealing for people to come and be secretary of this group, help with visits in this group, take on responsibilities in terms of looking at planning applications, etc. And I think recently we found it may well have something to do with people moving out of London, I don't know, and finding that now they don't have to go to the office 5 days a week. You're doing a 3-day, 2-day, and that kind of thing. That could be an opportunity. That could be something that is helping towards this. Whether people are retiring a bit earlier, I don't know. They do say that a lot of people over 50 have stopped working and actually are doing things more in the community. Or whether also there's actually an initiative in terms of people actually being conscious about their community and suddenly thinking that they can do a bit to help. Richard looks after the membership and is actually brilliant, bikes round and appears on the doorstep and confirms people's membership, asks them direct questions. I've never asked what, but somehow he manages to get them to agree to something.
Occasion.
No, it's getting better. So I think we're again looking on the positive side, but it's really quite, at the moment, it's quite encouraging. Having said this, we'll probably now go into a dearth of people and find it terribly difficult to get anyone.
Any questions in the room? Linda, yes.
I'm very intrigued, and I'm kind of torn by your approach to the river, because obviously the Avon is one of the defining characteristics of the city, that and the cathedral. Your opening slide, Stephanie, where you showed the sort of proposed scheme, and I think above it was as it is now, a sort of canonised version. You know, the vision of a sort of river park looked absolutely fantastic. But I'm interested to know how far you want to carry that through with the rest of the city. Because when you showed Fisherton Street and the idea of putting decking over that bit of the river, to me, that idea is appalling, because I think that I would far rather have that area sensitively and imaginatively made more sort of wildlife friendly. And I'm also intrigued by the fact that one of the awards that you showed of a riverbank, and it appeared to be clad in stone, which again is totally
The stone was already there. What had happened was they put down brushwood or something to form the basis for growing plants, and planted plants there. There was no artificial creation. They'd taken a very artificial riverbank and humanised it by finding ways in which to encourage natural water-loving plants to actually.
Well, that sounds more encouraging. But certainly, my question is sort of how far would you try and incorporate that elsewhere in the city, such as in Fisherton Street, and whether or not, as a civic society, obviously the emphasis is on the sort of built environment, but the role of green spaces within that built environment is clearly important as well. And I wondered how far you take that on board.
Yeah,
I'll start on this and pass over to Richard, but I think that our remit of the built environment as custodians of the built environment reaches out to landscape and green spaces, and we have several people on the development committee who are concerned with that, the Salisbury Area Green Space Partnership, and also from CPRE. So we are very aware, and it's always taken into consideration. I think Salisbury is an extraordinary city in the fact that it doesn't appear to celebrate its rivers. We have 5 rivers. It's not a confluence. The rivers run in eventually into the Avon, and the Avon starts and streams through, picks up the other rivers, and then comes out as the main river. So this new river corridor is a unique and essential initiative that is in progress now. Is actually the first real sort of use of river as I suppose as a community asset, and also to assist tourism in terms of getting people from the coach parks through to the city as well. Would you like to add some more?
Well, just to confirm what you're saying, Stephanie, about green space. I mean, Nicola Lipscomb, who is the head person of the Green Space Partnership, is probably one of the most active members of our committee, basically. Yep. She does an incredible amount of work, and green space and blue space is absolutely core to her remit. And she's also had a major input into the neighbourhood plan, where she's on the steering group. In terms of Salisbury's use of its rivers, this is something which has been recognised for many years. There was a very notorious town planner called Thomas Sharp back in the immediate post-war period. Thomas Sharp wrote a book called Exeter Phoenix, which was an indication of how the city could recover from wartime bombing. And in cahoots with the then council is probably what gave rise to the oft-quoted remark that what the German bombers started, the city fathers finished off. And there are very good examples. Exeter High Street is a very good example. You can see exactly where the bombing got to and where the character of the High Street disappeared. Thomas Sharp wrote a book called A Newer Serum, which is an absolutely disastrous book. It is typically written from that you can't stand in the way of progress mindset. So here we are, we've got this old city, you spend some time lauding its wonderful old buildings, and but they're all too old and not fit for purpose anymore. So I'm going to put a dual carriageway right round the city centre. Actually not round it, through it, charging through historic buildings. Even Thomas Sharp, in this rather extraordinary book, says Salisbury does not sufficiently recognise and make use of its rivers. Even Thomas Sharp, who, obviously I'm doing him down to a certain extent, he was a product of his period. Even Thomas Sharp realised the potential of Salisbury, and we've realised it, but I think this River Park is probably the first time that significant action has been taken. The River Park runs further north, up the Avon, more or less out into the countryside. It's not going down as far as Fisherton Street. It stops at a point north of that. The hope is eventually it'll go down to Fisherton Street. Beyond that, there's very little one can do with the rivers because of the constraints of where they flow. And obviously you get further out in the south, the Avon flows past the western edge of the Cathedral Close, and that's an absolutely wonderful landscape with water meadows and so forth. So it's central Salisbury, and the River Park should go a long way to actually starting to realise the potential of our rivers, which has been sadly neglected.
Thank you very much. Actually, unless there are any other questions, I would just like to carry on this theme to close the meeting. The reason being...
Actually close.
Yeah.
Can I say something about this book?
Yeah. Perhaps we'll bring in for a commercial spot at the end then. Basically, many of you may know that we have put in an application to have the floodplain and the downland above, to the north of the town, registered as a local heritage asset. The reason being that the opportunity arose because a budget was given to the council to open a register and to start registering county-wide assets of heritage significance, and it extends not only to buildings but to landscapes. And it seemed to us that it was an obvious thing to do to try to have that landscape recognized as a unique heritage asset. And of course, in our mind, is to make it much more difficult for the development plan to take place. So we're putting Dorset Council in front of this very difficult situation where they want to develop the land, and yet there's an application which has been very much encouraged by the county conservation officer to have it recognized as a heritage asset. So we want to build on this, and I shall be organizing a walk round the water meadows on the last Saturday of July between 2 to 4 in the afternoon. To be precise, I think it's the 30th of July, a 2-hour walk where I will take you round to show you what it is, explain to you why we have it and its importance to the town. It dates back to the 17th century, and it was basically on the agricultural system which it underpinned that the prosperity of the town was built. And that is one of the grounds for the application. The other being the literary aspect, because it inspired Thomas Hardy, and all the painters that came down were inspired, and composers, etc. So we are holding this event as part of a henge week, a national henge and historic sites week. And curiously, the Monday before, which is I suppose the 25th, there will be a talk given in Dorchester by a lady, Cathy Stern, who I think you know, about water meadows and their preservation. I think it's going to be in the museum in the evening. I did check the museum website before coming up, but it's not there. So we'll make inquiries, and we will publicize these two events on our website, so you will have the full details, so that to encourage you to come along and support us. So that's my commercial, and it's really to say that we're continuing beyond our program, defined program, to have this walk, and we've got the great chance of having the national expert on water meadows coming just before.
I like commercials. Could we have another commercial?
Yeah, we have a closing commercial.
It's not. I'm not trying to sell it. We haven't got that many copies left. We sold out most of them. But it's worth mentioning because this book, Salisbury in Detail, was published by the Salisbury Civic Society in 2009. I think Stephanie referred to it. It's basically 500 photographs and 10,000 words of text about the details of Salisbury buildings, taken totally by non-professional photographers. So basically, we got a group together, we trawled the streets, we came up with photographs, we came up with what we thought was quite a successful book, sold very well. And on Christmas Eve 2009, this was the best-selling book in Salisbury Waterstones, basically. And we then tried to encourage other people to take an interest, and that resulted in two more in-detail books. One is Eastbourne in Detail, not actually the Eastbourne Civic Society in the end, they were involved to some extent, and Peterborough in Detail, produced by the Peterborough Civic Society. And we think we've got a good template here if anyone else wants to get interested in a book like this. I think Dorchester is probably a bit small for just focus on the city, but as with Peterborough and its villages, Dorchester and its villages, might lend itself to this.
Well, I mean, curiously, we have been doing this work. I have been going round photographing all our listed buildings. We are going to start also doing a survey of their state and how they have evolved over the years, because we've got some old photographic surveys, two of them, and we're going to compare with the listed details, the listed building details, to see how the buildings have changed. And I'm actually starting to write a guide to buildings in Dorchester. So I'm just doing it for the High Street, for the Heritage Week in September. But I'd been thinking about extending to other streets, and perhaps what I should do is follow your example and see whether we couldn't publish, obviously not such a magisterial work as that, but a much shorter, more a booklet, but with photographs in.
What a good initiative.
So I will be in touch with you, and I'd very much like a copy, yes.
That commercial has worked.
It has, you've got one sale. Well, I think with that, it's a marvellous moment to call a close to a really interesting meeting with good questions and answers, and I think we have thought about many things, and we will profit from your experience in things we can do here in Dorchester. And actually, a further commercial, I will be organising a visit to the Harnham Water Meadows in Salisbury, because they have a Water Meadows Trust that has restored part of them, and we are wondering whether we couldn't get a trust set up in Dorchester to restore part of those water meadows, particularly if our application to have them listed is successful. And I do have in my mind's eye a part of the floodplain, which is actually, it's unfortunately only a very small one, owned by the Duchy, and perhaps there might be an opening there. So there again, I will let you know about the date. I mean, we were thinking initially it was just for the committee. It would be towards the end of July or August, but there would be a further visit in February when they actually do the flooding, because the flooding of the meadows is always in the winter. So we might just do a very restricted visit, but in July, August, and if any of you are interested, we'll fit you in. But perhaps a much more more numerous visit in February to see it actually operational.
It's really good, the flooding committee. It's well worth a visit.
So that follows on beautifully from the talk that's going to be given at the end of July, you see, and my walk. It all fits together. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Well, thank you. I think we can thank our speakers for a really informative and useful evening. Thank you very much.